Morning everyone, my name is Yael Refutation. The claim that I will be reviewing today, presented by Cristina Garcia, contain multiple components. After dissecting all the components of her main claim, I took out what I believe to be her main proposition. Smoking zones are necessary in all public areas to reduce harmful effects of secondhand smoke exposure. My opponent's secondary claims are the following. 1. Smoke zones will reduce the exposure of secondhand smoke for the non-smoker. 2. Smoke zones will reduce the amount of pollution. And 3. Smoke zones are effective and practical. As previously stated, my opponent's main claim contained multiple components, which happen to revolve around the first two secondary claims. My opponent's first secondary claim states that smoke zones will reduce the exposure of secondhand smoke for the non-smoker. Before examining the reasons presented, I would like to point out that many attempts by the government agencies and the tobacco industry to expose the dangers behind smoking. According to Tobacco Free California, since 1990, the California Tobacco Control Program has been producing hard-hitting educational advertisements to expose the dangers behind smoking, as presented in the Surgeon General's Report on the Health Consequences of Smoking, 1964-2014. It is true that smoking is detrimental to the health of the public. Most people in the room have either seen, most of you have seen ads in television or in billboards saying that smoking is harmful, right? And there's no doubt that it is harmful. So the question is, how would the zones can reduce the exposure of secondhand smoke? Clearly, the evidence presented only shows that the smoking is detrimental, but has failed to support how zones will change. My opponent only provided hypothetical examples, and she needed real examples in order to prove that these zones will work, ergo making the use of them obsolete. My opponent's second claim states that smoke zones will reduce the amount of pollution. Once again, my opponent failed to present actual facts instead of hypothetical examples. She presented hypothetical scenarios on how it can be achieved, and only presented evidence that shows the effects in water pollution. According to Asthma Australia, a non-profit organization that deals with smoking in Australia, poisons from cigarette smoke can remain in the air even though smoke can no longer be seen. Thus, it can be concluded that the smoking not only causes water pollution, but it also affects the air quality. Smoking zones will not reduce the pollution because the smoke emitted by the cigarettes will remain in the air and affect the air quality. Therefore, by having these smoking zones far away from the public, it's just not necessary because the smoke coming out from the cigarettes will remain there, and we have to breathe in order to survive. My opponent's third and final claim states that smoke zones are effective and practical. My opponent presented a comparison between attendance and smoking restrictions in two premier California destinations, Disneyland and the Dodger Stadium. First, I would like to point out that the data was presented incorrectly. After reviewing the evidence provided by the Baseball Almanac, I can conclude that her claim is irrelevant because it does not show that the proof of smoking, it does not show enough proof that smoking restrictions cause the higher attendance rates. She presented specific years that only showed increasing trends. For example, in 1993, the attendance for the Dodger Stadium was 3,170,393. 10 years later, in 2003, it was less than the previous one, at 3,138,626. I would also like to point out that the data mainly focus on the attendance rather than the effect of the smoke restrictions, and the benefits of having the smoke zones. Therefore, it can be concluded that the data presented was unrelated to the evidence that it negatively correlates to the main point. It is obvious that smoke is harmful to the health and the environment. And I believe that smoke zones are necessary because people will continue to disregard the effects from smoking. Thank you.
I want to start with the last point first because I thought that that was the one that you did the clearest job making an argument based on reasoning on. I thought that you suggested, for instance, that the advocate seemed to make the inference that the smoking zones at those locations had the effect on attendance, and you in essence suggested that there's no proof that there's a link to attendance based on the smoking zones, and in fact you've got a piece of information that shows that attendance has gone both up and down over the years, so there's no consistency in that relationship. And I think that that challenges the premise that the advocate is making. They're making a huge inference there based on a very small amount of data, and I think that you explained very reasonably how we can't reach that particular conclusion. Now, on the second point right above that, I think you do a similar kind of thing where, in essence, the argument is that I'm not going to deny that smoking is a pollutant. We're going to agree that smoking is a pollutant. The question is, are smoking zones going to change that? And I think that what you've done basically is by focusing on what the advocates, unfortunately having to infer what the advocate's main point was about the smoking zones would be beneficial or that they would be functional or work. When you say the only question is whether or not they would reduce pollution, to the atmosphere it's exactly the same. It doesn't matter where the cigarettes are burned. It just means that the smoke goes into the atmosphere. There's no demonstrable benefit to the environment that it is diffused or that it's focused in one location or the other. I think that's a reasonable challenge to make. I do think, though, that the advocate made an argument about the waste that comes from the cigarettes and that that is an issue that needed to be addressed a little bit more specifically. And then on the first point, your basic argument here is that the likelihood that people are going to benefit from these smoke zones is relatively small since people already know that cigarette smoking is dangerous. It's not as if there's going to be any demonstrable change in what that danger level is because of the smoke zones. I think your argument could be a little bit clearer there, but like I said, it felt to me like you actually went in the order of building your arguments from the weakest to the strongest. You finished with the strongest argument when it comes to your reasoning challenges. I think your evidence is maybe a little bit stronger on the middle point, but when it comes to the reasoning issue, the third point is the one that does the best job. And I thought you did a good job trying to summarize what the advocate's claim was. You basically are suggesting that it was not as clear as it needed to be, but when you look at the secondary claims, here's the inference about what the argument ultimately comes down to, and then here are the reasons why we shouldn't really believe that particular argument. I thought you did an okay job explaining those things. Done.
Happened anyway that time. Okay.
Thank you.